Okay, welcome to the final episode in the Stasis series. I've teased these guys all throughout the whole thing, so we're finally getting to them. Evolution is all about repurposing information that already exists in the parent generation, so it's quite interesting to note that there are snakes, frogs, lizards, lemurs, fish, and squirrels that all somehow have some sort of wings. So if God created these separately, they should have roughly as many subspecies as other created kinds taken on the ark, yet they don't. They are some of the smallest groups of organisms with very little diversity since they have only recently evolved. Flying squirrels do have more diversity than others and a longer history, but of course they do not display the kind of diversity that other squirrels do, which is exactly what we'd expect in evolutionary nested hierarchies of traits. There's a reason snakes have evolved gliding and legless lizards have not. Snakes have more ribs. Notice that they're able to flatten themselves only where the torso ribs are, while legless lizards are capable of slithering just fine without as long a torso. They probably don't have the evolutionary history to transition like flying snakes because they just can't flatten their whole body, since their tail is much longer. Don't try and tell me that these structures can't be modified and strengthened into full wings purely by microevolution. The flying snake and flying frog probably can't make that leap to powered flight, but the others are clearly working with small wings. They just need bigger and stronger wings, and the modifications required are minuscule. And again, if God made the flying squirrels separate, in which case he half-assed their wings and giving bats full wings for absolutely no reason, making your god look like a cruel idiot, or they evolved from regular squirrels and evolving further is easily possible, proving macroevolution. New structures from old ones purely through adaptations. Repurposing of limbs, ribs, fins, and skin folds can give new functions to pre-existing parts.
Also known as paradise flying snakes. They're one of only 5 species on the planet capable of gliding. And in a fraction of a second, can double the width of their bodies. They achieve this flattened position by spreading their ribs before undulating gracefully for up to 25 meters. Unbeknown to the Draco lizard, waving his dewlap and chasing females, has unwittingly advertised his whereabouts to a nearby predator. The paradise flying snake is a lizard eater. But the Draco pulls another trick from its arsenal. Destination locked on, and just in the nick of time, it too can play the flying game. Named after the Latin word for dragon, Draco lizards have a retractable wing, helping them glide through the air. Unlike the snake, folds of skin connected to their outstretched ribs allow them to skillfully swoop down to land right on target.
This is important because we see these flight traits in these animals being built not from totally new parts only a designer could stick on, but from parts that already exist in other snake and lizard populations, as modification with descent would predict. A designer could just pop in any old wings on these things, but instead they're limited to the traits of previous generations, something you'd only see in evolution. The flying lizards use their ribs and skin to form wings. If this was designed, why the hell didn't God give them wings for true powered flight? Why is he half-assing these guys' wings? Intelligent design provides us no answers. Variation within kind still allows for macro changes to functions of existing parts. For example, the repurposing of ribs and skin and limbs to create wings. There are no truly new parts here, just new arrangements of the same pre-existing traits that have different functions in the earlier and parent generations due to the different arrangement. There isn't a single part in these wings that isn't present in non-flying animals. This is why homology is important, and why hallmarks of intelligent design are never observed in nature. Every supposedly new part is made from parts that exist in close relatives. We never observe completely new parts that have no homology with similar organisms, which would be evidence for created kinds, but we don't ever see structures like that, not even in novel genes. No anatomical feature or even gene pops out of nowhere from scratch. It's always modified from some pre-existing parts or genetic material, and when the fossil record always has the most similar organisms next to each other in the layers, it becomes laughable that this pattern settled by random chance in a single worldwide flood. For example, this frogfish is moving exclusively on legs, but we can see that the legs are in the positions and made from parts homologous only with fish fins. They're not even in the optimal locations like we'd expect for intelligent design. Their function is clearly transitional. Now, this is called the sea robin. This could possibly become some new form of spider amphibian in the future. It looks like God just stuck some spider legs onto the front of it. But as we can see, it's all parts that fish already have. They're just modified from fin bones, and instead of being straight and connected by a webbed membrane like in the rest of the fins, they're curved and individually unconnected to the others, so they're free to move independently. Fins do have muscles at their base, so this is again just modification of existing parts. This is all change within the narrow limitations of microevolution that creationists already accept. Creationists are missing out on the true miracle of biology when they limit their God's creation to a specific kind. A truly awe-inspiring God could make organisms capable of adapting past some narrow, limited type or form. Only a limited God would limit his creations to a certain kind. Now, what happens if this fish quote-unquote devolves and loses its more fishy fins? Would it be a spider fish of some new kind? That's quite a large change in form, even though creationists admit it should be possible. That's just assuming this was a created kind itself and not evolved from some other kind of fish, but the mere fact that it can be recognized as a fish proves that it is merely a modified fish, even if separately created by God, since it has all of the homologous parts that normal fish have. They're just arranged slightly differently. We see that flying fish changed a lot over time too. Differences in the skull dimensions, longer, thinner torsos with more ribs, bigger front and back fins, which are just enlarged parts of typical fish. The sea robin also has large fins like this, but it cannot fly, however it can crawl. There is no biology limiting such a transition. It's silly to think that these adaptations cannot happen. Fish with huge fins and the ability to flap them can indeed cause lift, and they do.
But these particular fish have a unique ability. They're flying fish. With an extra thrust from their tails, the flying fish get airborne once more. With a good wind, they can glide for hundreds of meters.
Even more powerful muscles and perhaps bigger fins could unlock sustained true flight without any intelligent design, purely through natural adaptation of pre-existing traits, resulting in macroevolution of flight wings on fish. Almost any fish could start down this evolutionary path, and the big fins don't necessarily need to be used for jumping or flying at first. Like I said, we know of fish that have large fins like this, but do not fly. But once they start using these large fins to jump out of the water, they can start doing this more and more and more efficiently. This is also a fish, but it has robust frog-like legs. It's clearly a living transitional form with legs made purely from fin parts. All parts have homology with fish parts, indicating modification from a fish template rather than a wholly individually engineered form. And yet we can clearly identify that these parts are derived from fish parts. Common parts from a common designer? Well, that still admits evolution can happen, as even if this is a designed animal, God took a fish template and modified its fins into legs. He didn't just stick frog legs onto the animal, as they still retain clearly fin-like traits and homology, but with the functions of walking limbs. When the common parts from a common designer argument is used, this admits that the differences are so small as to be covered by natural within-kind variation. If they're made from the same parts but they have different functions and different arrangements, that means that evolution can do that all on its own without any need to invoke a god. The fewer assumptions we make, the more scientific our hypothesis is. To further illustrate the point, this is a demonstration of a butterfly snail swimming, using parts all snails already have for a new function. This is how evolution works with modification of inherited traits. No trait comes out of nowhere. That would be intelligent design, and the reason for pointing out homology is to show that every part is merely a modified version of a previous one in the lineage. So, in the case of butterfly snails, some extra skin and muscles are all that's needed to take an animal that slinks along the ground on one slimy foot to an animal that can swim in 3 dimensions with a wing-like motion, all with minor within-kind microadaptation. It's just enlarging of parts that it already has. Now, I was asked to make a video about bat stasis, and it became this whole series. So finally, we'll go over bats as relevant to the topic of gliding animals. These are living transitional forms. The claim by creationists is that bats have always been bats with no major changes. Answers in Genesis recognizes 18 bat kinds ranging from 1 to several hundred species each. Ignoring the inconsistent speciation rates, there are astounding changes that AIG admits happened within kind. It is well documented that species can and often do differ far more within themselves than between typical members of more distantly related species. As traits are always changing, there are always viable mutants in the population, even though there is a typical form making up the majority of the population. AIG tries to insinuate that Paleochiropteryx is the new oldest bat, but no, Iconorictus is still older. We don't see echolocation bones until the Middle Eocene. The bats older than this lack those bones, so more blatant misinformation from the creationists, which is easily fact-checked, but there is no competence in any of their authors. So the oldest known bat doesn't have echolocation, but the next oldest known bats have the necessary bones. But the ear bones are just not as large as modern bats proportionally, thus demonstrating a fossil transition from smaller to larger. Creationists can't say God gave some bats echolocation because they have to hunt insects. They could just as easily eat fruit. Especially according to Kent Hovind, you can just start eating anything and develop digestive adaptations.
I bet people on a deserted island, if they were dying of starvation, could probably learn to digest trees and eat leaves and trees.
Oh, I don't think.
So echolocation is not a necessary feature. But as I just stated, these fossil bats have halfway evolved echolocation. They're in between the oldest and modern bats in size. Why would God give them half a trait or a half functional trait? The echolocation bones are just enlarged versions of normal ear bones anyway, so nothing truly new that microevolution couldn't produce, and in the exact order that evolution would expect. The diversity in bats is similar to that among canid kinds. Some bats even look like canids, from foxes to pugs to Labradors. That's because all mammals are variations on the same basic themes, rather than separately created with fundamentally different components. Creationists do actually claim that these two are related, one of 186 species of Old World bats, of which only one species has echolocation. So we can show that some species of fruit bats are designed with echolocation and others are not, so it's not a necessary feature. Why then is it so inconsistently distributed when the main difference is simply the size of the cochlear bones? That's just microevolution. Again, intelligent design fails to explain anything. These species have huge morphological differences and admitted by one of the largest creationist institutions as being the same kind. Meanwhile, these are apparently different kinds. How can creationists tell? Because one has a slightly pointier nose that they're not related? But AIG also claims that these two are related in the same kind, yet they are far more different than these supposedly separate kinds. These are not related, but these are? What's wrong with these people's standards? These are all the same kind, according to AIG, a leading creationist quote-unquote science journal, and yet their range of morphology is greater than across supposedly unrelated kinds. What the hell is up with that? There is more diversity in this kind than there is in the great apes. Not to mention their diets, which is the most diverse of all bats. Vampire bats drink blood, while others in the Philostomatidae eat fruits, others drink nectar, some hunt insects, while others still eat fruit and insects or supplement one fruit source for the other on rare occasions. So we have proven creationists admit the evolutionary capacity to change diet to just about anything, and yet they admit it happened for sure. Digestion of different materials requires different proteins. That's macroevolution. Bat stasis, even in creationism, is non-existent. Again, creationists say these two are in the same kind, yet the differences are striking. There isn't any morphological stability here. Creationists lose their excuses of a common designer with many features like echolocation and bats' tails. Some have them, others do not. God did not put common parts in for common function or reason. Rather, the only explanation for this is adaptation of inherited traits, as some bats clearly do not need tails since they don't have them, yet they retain vestigial features that no designer would bother to put in if he was just going to make it negligibly tiny. An intelligent designer would just put in no tail at all. Even assuming creationism is true, every single feature in every organism is derived from a similar organism. Intelligent designers have no reason to do this whatsoever. The first bats had long tails because they evolved from shrew and lemur-like tree-climbing mammals, which of course evolved from rodent-like mammals. All had long tails, and so did the oldest bats, a prediction that can be made with evolution but not with intelligent design. The earliest bats had claws on all 5 of their fingers. Later bats only have claws on 1 or 2 fingers. Those bats who died and thus were available at the time of Noah did not have the ear bones necessary for echolocation. They only later gained the necessary ear structures for echolocation. Anatomical changes within kind and explained by minor modifications to existing structures. Stasis in bats overturned with creationist sources. A new function from old parts should qualify as macroevolution. Some bats also have ankle spurs, others do not. If Noah's flood were true, then God would have deliberately deprived some of the bats of tails and others of echolocation for absolutely no apparent reason, even though these traits are apparently useful and necessary functions in some bats, but not in others. So this begs the question, why did God make them like that? Clearly the bat form doesn't need tails or all of its fingernails or echolocation, since some get along fine without them. What's the point of separately creating some bats with echolocation and others without? Same goes for tails. This only gives ammunition to the idea of modification with descent. These differences are an absurdity under creationist assumptions unless they allow these traits to have evolved, which in fact they do, as many of these traits differ within the stated bat kinds. So, bats are flying shrews, essentially. There are no limits between these kinds. They are simply modified versions of one another, and we can connect all of life this way. If we take a shrew and elongate the fingers, we have the skeletons of early bat fossils. That's it. There is no other notable difference. But there are much larger differences among bats themselves than between bats and shrews, because bats are not under stasis. Why would bats go through a transitional phase with longer and longer fingers? Clearly, just slightly longer fingers alone can't produce flight. There are other components to a wing. Was there some plan to become a bat? No. They would have gained a benefit from longer fingers being able to grasp branches and trunks better. At some point, long fingers would be able to support wings, and any creature born with extra skin would be able to jump and slow their fall, even with short fingers, like flying squirrels. These are all transitions that creationists assert are true. And if this can happen, just about any proposed evolutionary transition can happen. Every transition is just based on a change in the shape, scale, orientation, or number of bones, all of which have been proven possible across the animal kingdom. If macro changes to skull or foot morphology can occur within kind, then this process can be repeated across multiple body parts and give you a very different body form over time. The creationists axiomatically just reject this because they're trying to protect their myth. So why is it so difficult for them to understand the same thing that they already admit to, just applied consistently across all available data? There is no reason for homology in intelligent design. All of these features have successful designs using different parts, using different arrangements of the same part. God could have left a calling card by making them out of different parts, and yet the pattern is exactly that which evolution would predict, and creationists are not able to make any predictions about the fossil record, thus making it completely scientifically useless hypothesis, even assuming it's true. The truth is, creationists don't want it to be true. They aren't following the evidence, they're twisting it for their own purposes, usually by cherry picking. The only thing that separates these species is scale of certain facial and cranial features, something we know happens in lots of animals. So if we can recognize these as being possibly related, all based on the same original content, then we can understand evolution. But that would mean humans are just monkeys. Oh well, facts don't care about your feelings. So what happens if flying squirrels get better at flying? Would they become a new kind? Or just a squirrel with new abilities? We already know that greater morphological distances are already admitted by creationists. Would this not count as macroevolution? Totally new function evolved from pre-existing traits in the squirrel lineage. Just some extra skin and longer fingers, whereas they already allow for greater changes in the skulls alone within kind. Is there anyone daft enough to deny that flying squirrels are indeed related to squirrels? How could they even tell? How is a creationist supposed to argue that small mammals can't have extra skin in the natural range of variation? That's just all that separates many gliding animals from their climbing cousins. Well, they can't deny it. They even admit that there are gliding and non-gliding species in the same created kinds. They do recognize flying squirrels as evolved from tree squirrels. The dominoes just keep falling. This is it. This is proof that evolutionary stasis is a misconception, a bunk creationist talking point that even they have to admit is not true. And I'm using creationist sources to prove it. This is macroevolution, though they'd never admit it. Going from a climbing animal to a gliding animal is macroevolution, and that's within kind. So according to creationist sources, they admit that flying squirrels evolved this new bone in their wrists. Either it's a new bone, or since they only have 4 fingers, it evolved into a different shape from an existing finger. Seeing as AIG admits they're related to regular squirrels, I think they prefer to admit that the pinky finger turned into crescent than to admit that the crescent evolved into an articulated pinky finger. So there's no way to argue that flying squirrels were the original creation and that tree squirrels are quote-unquote devolved forms who lost their wing-like structures. AIG even goes as far as to admit that marmots are evolved from squirrels. Man, that arc really doesn't have much room on it, does it? They have to keep shoving in morphologically different animals into the same created kinds just to fit them all in. And if the flying squirrels can evolve from normal squirrels, and marmots can evolve from normal squirrels, then why can't a large squirrel evolve a flat, scaly tail like a beaver? There's already a scaly-tailed squirrel kind, and some are climbers while others are gliders. This is why we say microevolution is macroevolution. The amount of microevolution creationists accept within the kinds they assert often exceeds the amount of difference between supposedly unrelated kinds. Beavers should be able to evolve from marmot-like animals if flying squirrels can, especially if rodents have scaly tails, which many do. What would prevent a rodent's tail from flattening out? Nothing. This is merely within-kind microevolutionary change. Otters did it. AIG considers all otters to be one kind, so why couldn't it happen to marmots as well? I'm honestly trying to understand, at the biochemical level, why many creationists claim evolution to be impossible, since it's clearly possible. Since every change that evolution proposes is actually happening within various biblical kinds. By the way, scales on the basal mammals is just more evidence of coming from reptilian species. The mammals thought to be closest to reptiles just happen to be the scaliest, and just happen to have every anatomical feature that every single mammal is derived from. Who could have predicted this? Oh, that's right, evolutionary biologists. Creationism is all about cherry picking, because if one looks at the actual pattern in the big picture, you start to see that you can't defend the flood story without leaning on macroevolution. Since to have enough room on the ark, they have to group in morphologically different animals into the same kinds. If flying squirrels can evolve from squirrels, why can't bats evolve from similar mammals? Because reasons. And for that matter, how are creationists determining that squirrels aren't evolved from a non-squirrel rodent ancestor? The poofiness of their tail is basically the only difference, especially at the skeletal level. All these differences are accounted for by creationist-approved microevolution. However, creationists just state as an axiom that new kinds cannot evolve, even though they already admitted that evolution from lizard kind to snake kind is possible. Every squirrel trait is found in basal rodent anatomy. Same with bats and lemurs. Their anatomy is fully accounted for by pre-existing structures in tree-climbing mammals. None of these are separated by large differences. Basically the same anatomy, only different in scale. Again, canids and felines and horses display more morphological diversity in their biblical kinds than between the rodents, so all of these should be explainable by the same process. But again, that would imply too high a speciation rate post-arc, so creationism has to fudge the numbers, especially when it comes to physically small and highly diverse clades, and they think they can get away with it because they're small, so you can fit a lot more of them on the ark, so they separate all small animals into more kinds than they do the large animals. This isn't for any scientific reason, just to fudge the numbers so the myth can fit. They end up shooting themselves in the foot because they accept larger morphological differences in the large animals than they do in the smaller animals, giving away their hand that they're just trying to fit them all on the ark. We see common faces in biology not because God was lazy and reproduced his designs over and over again, not because they were necessary to any specific design type, but because traits are inherited. Evolution can only work with inherited traits. Nothing comes out of nowhere, nothing comes from scratch. Evolution is limited by the traits of the parent generation, and most of life is so specific, and not just specific, but a specific set of dozens, even hundreds of unique diagnostic traits that are nested in hierarchies, none of which are inherently necessary on their own for survival, many of which other animals would appreciate if a designer could just slap parts onto other designs, such as gills or echolocation. Wouldn't we all be better off with those traits? Why do they only follow inheritance patterns? New traits are responses to environmental pressures, changing functions of existing traits. Flying lemurs represent the exact transitional morphology predicted by bad evolution, down to their resemblance to shrews and sleeping upside down. They have much longer fingers than flying squirrels, which may explain why flying squirrels don't sleep upside down, but flying lemurs and bats do. If we take a look at their entire skeleton, it's incredibly similar to proposed transitional bats and shrews. They have extremely exaggerated long arm and finger bones, exactly transitional between a climbing mammal and a flying one. Normal lemurs do not have such long arms and fingers. These also help us to understand how bats would transition to sleeping upside down. They would have begun doing this before they lost the ability to use their hands for grasping and climbing. Right now, flying lemur arms serve a dual function of climbing and gliding. Now, they could give up true flight for that hybrid function, or they could give up their grasping hands for better wings. Evolution is never a linear, universal fitness increase. It usually involves trade-offs. However, the fact that they already sleep upside down like bats affords the option of losing functional grasping hands, since their feet can do most of the work they need to do already. Wings and vertebrates always consist of parts identifiable as modified parts of hands and arms. Since we also have transitions in between both forms, this shows that they're plastic enough to cross over. There are points in which you can't tell which one it is. Archaeopteryx is declared as a bird by most creationists. Well, it's not quite. Its skeleton is that of a theropod dinosaur. No extant birds have dinosaur skulls or unfused finger bones like Archaeopteryx does, and yet when you cover a theropod with feathers, it looks like a bird to creationists. Thanks for proving our point yet again that minor changes can make huge differences, and instead of having parts designed from the ground up, it's always parts from the closest thing in the nested hierarchy. We don't have partially evolved bat wings, one, because the fossil record is continuously being filled in, and we haven't explored it all or found all the fossils, and we're always finding new ones, but two, because creationists wouldn't recognize them as bats. They'd just say that they're long-fingered rodents. But we do have partially evolved wings in other animals, so they have to admit that transitional wings are possible. The common parts argument is actually an argument for evolution. The differences between flying lemurs and lemurs is some extra skin and longer fingers, and yet creationists accept more radical changes in squirrels since the flood, yet they classify flying lemurs as separate from typical lemurs. The inconsistency and hypocrisy of creationism knows no bounds. This is an important issue because, for example, a monkey is basically just a lemur with a shorter face, something we can all recognize as possible through macroevolution, but creationists just claim it didn't happen for no reason, even though they accept more radical changes within the same kinds, like in bats. Creationists cannot work with patterns, they can only cherry-pick exceptions. Huge differences in shape are accepted by creationists as caused by genetics. Why then do they draw the line where reshaping of existing bones and muscle groups explains the gaps between all organisms? We can actually observe this happening in real time. This species of catfish rapidly developed new fin skeletons. Each letter on this figure is a different individual of the same species, each with differently developed skeletons, same gene pool. As you can see, it doesn't just produce absolute nonsense. It does produce functional structures, though through random mutations. Invariably, creationists will claim this is just epigenetics, but if that's the case, epigenetics is just another heritable way to change skeletal anatomy and physiology, so it's just still evolution. Modification of pre-existing parts for new structures. We have observed in our lifetimes pigs evolving new ribs and vertebrae, and it does not affect the viability or health of the offspring. Pigs were bred by humans in the modern day to have new skeletal parts. This occurs naturally, but the ones who did it were just selected and bred more than the others. This is precisely what Nephilim-Free and Ramat claimed would prove evolution.
Morphological change doesn't equate to anatomical change. And so So if
larger dog,
if a,
smaller dog. Hold on. Let me finish addressing it. The shape of the skull of a Chihuahua is remarkably different from that of a Collie, and yet they're fully dog with all the same features in the same location of the same body plan, of the same type, of the same design. Right. So it's clearly a dog. Shape and color and pattern and size are insufficient as evidence of evolution. No, there would be a body plan change if you did loses features that are part of the body plan. That would be a body plan change. Yeah.
all of those things are
So,
possible via
so
microevolution.
have we seen that occur? Have we seen that happen in dogs?
All of those things are possible in microevolution. We've seen them in several species.
We're looking for even a single anatomical feature change. Any physiological change would be proving evolution to us. Let's take any change. You know what I mean? Like where's like the new extra rib in human beings, or the extra spinal column?
Proof of anatomical differences within kind. And yes, AIG does claim that all these pigs are related as the same kind. So we do know that snakes and legless lizards could also do the same thing when evolving from shorter lizards. Even pig teat number is known to vary among the same species. There is variation in canine vertebrae too, showing that bones can be lost and be fused like in bird evolution without loss of fitness. Again, dogs show remarkable skeletal plasticity and bats even more within admitted creationist kinds. All these admittedly related species have also evolved different chromosomal numbers over and over and over again without killing them or appearing to have any lasting negative effects, and it won't stop where it is either. But creationists say they're all related, so then why do they say chromosomal splits or fusions are impossible for human evolution? Because it's not about being consistent, it's about ad hoc excuses to protect a myth. These guys can interbreed, but they create sterile offspring, and the red ones tend to kill and eat the white ones. Is this the behavior of the same kind? Interesting that God would create some animals more violent and sinful than others just because a human disobeyed him, without any proper education in what good or evil was in the first place. Other hybrids include the mule, the comma, or the liger. As far as we know, all mules and jennies are sterile. Same with the commas, but only 2 have been produced since they're not mechanically capable of breeding. So if creationists want to admit that camels and llamas are related because they can produce a comma, they have to admit that there's been such macroevolution that they can't even mechanically get each other pregnant. They require the help of scientists to do this. We even know animals with different numbers of chromosomes can breed, so we know that differing numbers of chromosomes can evolve in a single kind and result in 2 different healthy species that can't create anything but one generation of sterile offspring. Yet they share a common ancestor. You can reject creationist institutes and say canids and even all foxes aren't all related with their chromosome number changes, but you can't get out of the horse kind, since they can breed and make mules. And the more you break up these kinds, the less room you have on the ark. There are countless mules worldwide, but no mule can bring forth with any other mule, or any animal for that matter, so mules aren't even the same kind as mules by creationist definitions, going off what can bring forth with each other. Every logical implication of creationism leads to absurdities. It's just, creationism is the textbook definition of reductio ad absurdum. Dogs have also evolved new facial muscles that other canids lack. Again, it's just regulation of existing muscle genes to grow simple muscles in slightly new locations. But if you can grow one new muscle group and you can grow new bones and reshape and relocate them, then you can build pretty much any skeletal or muscle system purely through evolution. But we have only witnessed a couple of these changes in human history, while with creationist speciation rates, we should expect much faster observable evolution with new features every year. The Patagonian weasel Lyncodon is almost identical in every way to its sister, the Galactus, except there is a unique muscle group not found in any other mammal on Earth. Did God specifically create 2 Patagonian weasels just to give one slightly better paws? Why didn't God reuse the set of muscles on any other animal, consistent with the common parts excuses? Or is it more scientific explanation to apply what we know about how muscles can duplicate and move position and change shape to explain why one weasel has a few more muscles in its paws? But if we admit that, we admit all of macroevolution is justified by these same processes. Plus, AIG claims all mustelids are related, so we know these muscles evolved, at least by creationist standards. Creationists admit all weasels are related to all badgers and all otters. So unless the Patagonian weasel is the most basal of all the mustelid kinds, then creationists have admitted that they evolved a completely new muscle group that no other animal in existence has. How is biochemistry coordinating this? Even if you say it's epigenetics, you still say that this cannot be coordinated by mere random chance. This is a death stroke to the creationist argument. So assuming the Patagonian weasel is the first of all this created kind, since it has unique muscles that could have been lost by subsequent generations, that then forces creationists to admit that the anatomical differences between weasels and otters and badgers are evolved, so they're screwed either way. Some otters are very weasel-like, while others not so much, and still others look like they're on the cusp of being seals with their paddle-like flipper feet. Again, creationists claim that such coordinated design changes cannot occur by random chance. And yet here they are admitting that these changes occur within the same kinds. Remember, creationists admit that these are evolved from weasels. They're all in the same kind. So they admit flippers can evolve from terrestrial feet, and we have more or less seal-like versions in otter variations. Sea otters are closer to seals, while river otters are more like flat-footed swimmy weasels. Seal limbs are obviously modified from terrestrial animals. Creationists don't bother classifying seals since they claim they can swim and ostensibly survive the flood. You know, even though they usually sleep on land, some can sleep in the water, but it requires calm waters, and that's not exactly what they're claiming Noah's flood was. So no, seals probably could not survive a worldwide cataclysm off the ark, and if they're designed, why do they have fingers and fingernails instead of just smooth flippers? Because they inherited these traits from land mammals. Does this remind you of anything? There is no reason a seal needs toenails. They're obviously vestigial remains of terrestrial mammal. Only difference is that sea otters can spread those legs a little wider. If otters fused their hind legs a little, something creationists would normally call a deleterious mutation, they'd look just like seals, which is a perfectly functional form.
Let's go!
Seals have the same basic structures as otters and evolved in nearly identical ways from similar carnivorous animals. Creationists accept this happened from otters to weasels, but not seals or whales for some reason. Actually, the reason is because they have to bring otters on the ark and wouldn't have any room for them if they were divided up into so many kinds. But even so, the majority of land animals and the majority of sea animals died in the flood, and even a majority of every species that was saved on the ark died in the flood, even though God could have easily just saved them all with less effort than snapping one's fingers. So if they can admit the weasels evolved into these aquatic animals, why can't further changes happen, like losing their fur and hind limbs, or getting stronger tails, or more blubber? They look like whales at that point. They're already practically long-haired seals. How can creationists say that whale evolution is not possible? They can't. All they can claim is we didn't see it happening, even though the fossils were found because of evolutionary predictions, in the order that only evolution would expect, and in locations only real geology can identify. Some otters are adapted for life in the seawater, some are adapted for life in freshwater, some can barely walk on land at all. Sea otters can also sleep in the water too. This is half of whale evolution right there, admitted by creationists. AIG is apparently okay with terrestrial mammal feet evolving into fully aquatic paddle feet, so what objection do they have for this happening in whale evolution? This would require coordinated changes, but they're admitting it's happened. This would be the equivalent of a large otter losing hair, getting paddle-like front feet, a larger tail, and slightly higher nostrils. Weasel to otter is macroevolution, yet answers in Genesis say it happened. They claim these two different kinds of animals are one related kind. There isn't one step in whale evolution that isn't covered by similar processes admitted by creationists. We know nostrils can change location. We know limbs can shrink. We know limbs can evolve into paddle-like fins. We know animals can lose hair. We know they can evolve more ribs and vertebrae within their own species. And we know that land mammals can adapt to live and sleep in not just water, but salt water, as admitted by weasel to otter evolution, so creationism is completely out of excuses. Of course, they'll try the old de-evolution distraction due to loss of traits. The thing is, de-evolution is just evolution. The closest thing they have is genomic meltdown, which is species going extinct due to accumulation of deleterious mutations, but these species are getting more fit in their environment, so it's going in the right direction, as they would say. It's just adaptation, not some kind of progression towards holistic dysfunction. The loss of these features makes them fitter in their environment, which should not be possible under assumptions like created kinds and irreducible complexity, yet they admit it happened in otters. Instead, morphology is far more flexible than creationists want to admit, and thus it makes homology highly unlikely without common ancestry, due to the fact that God's supposed creation can use all kinds of different structures for the same task, such as wing structure or digit number. There is no argument to be made that the shared morphology is created, since there is no reason God would need to repeat the same motifs, the same bones, same numbers, if they can be made so differently with different numbers and different structures. Instead, the same motifs repeat in the creatures who are already sharing overwhelming similarities, and which are close to each other in the fossil record, as evolution would predict. Loss of features is evolution, whether they like it or not, even if it's toward dysfunction. This is one of the most pernicious mind viruses creationism infects people with. If, say, an otter population loses hair, increases in overall size, loses its hind limbs, gets a stronger, flatter tail with shorter, stubbier front limbs, and its nostrils move slightly on its skull, all minor adaptations creationists admit are possible and that we observe in real time, then you will have evolved a whale-type body form from an otter, a new kind from an existing one, aka macroevolution. They cannot accept or even address this example. Every single creationist I've ever talked to about whale evolution has weaseled out of this. However, they straight up admit that snakes could have done such a thing, losing limbs from a lizard, but give a couple really weak excuses as to why it just so happens to have not happened, even though it's possible. A lizard to snake is macroevolution, one kind to the other, by creationist definition. Even a lizard to a legless lizard is macroevolution. It's a totally different kind of lizard, and they categorize them that way, yet they admit it's possible. The gross change in morphology and the fact that they maintained or increased their fitness level absolutely destroys the creationist argument of de-evolution. Also, even if the trend of evolution was towards dysfunction, that doesn't change anything. Maybe the next step in whales is for them to keep losing features and turn into wormy creatures, and maybe they go extinct because they can't compete for food. Oh well, that's still evolution. Whale to cancer worm would still be a change in kind. These atavistic hind flippers are best explained by evolution rather than design, since they clearly aren't needed by the majority of whales. Most whales do not have hind limb flippers at all. This is a mutation. So either creationists are admitting that mutations can build new information and structures that aren't part of the population's history already, indicating macroevolution, or they have evolutionary history that includes these limbs that they don't need. Since their forms don't need these flippers, God would have no reason to put a back channel into their DNA so that they could one day have them. They don't need them now, so this exclusively indicates macroevolution. Assuming whales or dolphins were separately created, God put in information for structures they don't need for no reason whatsoever. So the only purpose of a designer doing this would be to give more ammunition to evolution on purpose. So that God would either want us to believe in evolution, or he's really stupid for putting these things in there that indicate evolution exclusively if he doesn't want us to believe in evolution. I'm not sure why an intelligent God would continuously leave breadcrumbs for evolution when he could just not, and the design would work fine anyway. Stasis to a creationist means no macroevolution. However, they define macroevolution as a change in kind, so no matter how much change you can show within kind, even if it's objectively macroevolution by scientific standards, they'll just say it never changed kind, even if we get new muscles, new bones, and new morphologies, all happening within kinds. They try to define away the problem in their ideology, but it ends up defeating itself, as all falsehoods do. There is stasis because there's no macroevolution, and no macroevolution because of stasis. It's circular reasoning, which you can't actually quantify a basis for by their own standards. However, they admit that lizards, as they define as a separate kind from snakes, can evolve from one to the other. So they already demonstrate how broken their definition is by themselves without any help from actual scientists. So have I shown macroevolution here? By objective definitions, yes, and by creationist definitions, yes. I have shown change of gross morphology within related species, even within biblical kinds. And I've shown leading creationists admit that kind-to-kind evolution is possible. I've proved that every mechanism of macroevolution is possible. The only possible objection they could have is that this very possible process is just not borne out in the fossil record, or we don't have time for it to happen. But when the fossil pattern is predicted accurately by evolution, and creationists defeat their own arguments with super fast post-flood evolution. So, importantly, these questions just come down to geology. I have simply proven that they have no case against evolution in biology. They have to show how geologic sciences are wrong, and they can't. If oil companies could find more oil with creationist geology, they'd hire young Earth creationists, but they don't. And creationism can't predict any fossil forms like evolution has hundreds of times. That's how science proves itself. So evolution is science by definition, even if it's wrong. So, quick review. We've seen proof of variation of skeletal structure from new vertebrae and ribs, as well as teats and pigs, and radically different fin skeletons in the same catfish species, observed and recorded and repeated in real time by modern humans. And these are just a couple of examples of confirmed within-kind skeletal changes. In the first episode, we covered confirmed beneficial mutations which create new information on the molecular level. We've seen massive morphological differences within biblical kinds, often which are much larger than the differences between supposedly separate kinds. These alone show an admitted lack of stasis within them, and thus macroevolution. From the wildly different bats within the same kind, often far different than examples of bats across biblical kinds. Creationists admit macroevolution of lizards to snakes is possible, defining them as different kinds, then admitting it's possible for one to transition to the other through microevolution, thus proving that microevolution is macroevolution. They admit that these are related. This is clearly a step in the direction of bat evolution, proving transitional forms exist within biblical kinds, and we are witness to it in real time. New functions from inherited parts. Badgers and otters evolved new morphologies from weasels, which themselves evolved different muscle groups, all within the same biblical kind. Horses evolved totally new leg and foot structures, coordinated changes made purely through variation within kind. And bats did evolve new skull and tooth shapes, and did evolve echolocation, since the most unified trait is not having echolocation, and the only morphological difference within echolocation is the proportion of their ear bones, as well as large facial differences within the same biblical kinds. We have admission from creationists that macroevolution occurs within related kind, thus refuting the creationist idea of stasis by their own definitions using their own so-called research. And where they assert animals are different kinds, they cannot reasonably provide any explanation of where the diversification stops, since every type of change proposed by evolution has been observed in some species in modern times, proving that amount of change needed to bridge the gaps is already exceeded by observed changes. It's only a question of whether a possible transition did happen, or if there's enough time for it to happen. Here I have argued any biological excuses out of the creationists, and all we have to argue about now is geology. Plants also display huge morphological diversity, but also huge similarities to the point where it convinces creationists that two very different organisms have a common ancestor. Scaling explains a lot of evolution all on its own. Special thanks to Emotionally Stunted Emoticon for a few slides and some great research. We've both been working on illustrations of macroevolutionary examples for quite some time now. Finally, I'll mention parasitic life that requires macroevolution on the physical, behavioral, and chemical level in order to become dependent on consuming other beings, and we know that God didn't create them that way, since God did not allow death or killing or carnivorous beings in his original created forms, due to them being created in the garden before the fall, before death entered the world. So what about the wasps that lay eggs in the bodies of other animals, gutworms and leeches, the fungi, and even worms that cause insects to become zombies, the crustaceans that eat the tongues of fish and then live in their mouths as their new tongues, consuming the food that comes through the mouth, the hermit crabs who only live in the shells of dead snails. Hell, any diseases that kill any cells at all violates the original creation, not to mention organisms that thrive on dead bodies of others, the decomposers, all that would have to evolve a lot after the original creation and fall, and these changes are so drastic that it must constitute macroevolution. If the excuse is that God pre-designed them to have these back channels that would turn on later, when death entered the world, to have the ability to evolve into these death-mongering forms via created heterozygosity, I'm also left wondering why God didn't just make all animals vegetarians. Why are some of them created to take advantage of death in such evil and violent ways, while others are allowed to just keep eating veggies? These animals did nothing to God. This is Leucochloridium paradoxum, a type of worm that crawls into snails' eyeballs, mind controls them to hang out exposed, engorges the eyes and pulsates them so that they're noticed and eaten by birds, replicate in the birds, and then get excreted in bird poop to be eaten again by the snails, so that the whole process can start all over again. Now, either God specifically designed these things to exist in that absurdly violent and wholly unnecessary lifestyle, or they evolved. While obviously biology allows these things to evolve from normal worms, this would be macroevolution, so a creationist cannot excuse its origins from non-killing Garden of Eden variety animals. These worms mind control their host to drown themselves so they can escape into the water and breed again. Either God specifically designed something so evil and violent when he could have just made them vegetarians, or they macroevolved. Which is a better explanation? So, that's the end of the Stasis series. I'll leave you with a cat that has 4 ears, which shows that you can build new parts from existing information via mutations. Look at it, it's cute. Like and subscribe to my channel, or this cat will hypnotize and eat you. Wait a second. Oh no, I repent. Evolution really is the devil. Or maybe it's just cats. Thanks for watching. Snake out.